My Uncle David was an eccentric man. That's not code to say that he was some kind of deviant. In fact, he was a pleasant and caring man for most of his life. However, he was also a sensitive soul and not much of a people person. David never got married or had children. He lived alone his whole life and worked a dull job in the civil service. Yes, David was definitely an introvert and may have been on the spectrum. But he kept to himself and indulged in his unusual hobbies, some of which became obsessions. I guess that's why he bought the model village. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept, a model or miniature village is an attraction closely associated with the English countryside, although there are a few left in existence in the 21st century. Some date back to the 19th century, but their popularity peaked from the 1930s to 1950s. Essentially, they are outdoor scale models turned into very detailed exhibits replicating towns or villages, containing everything from miniature churches, houses, railways, canals, and parks, and figurines representing small people, men, women, children, and even pets. The level of detail is impressive, and there's a quaint and almost magical feel to such attractions. But of course, like so much else, model villages have lost much of their appeal in the modern digital age, unable to compete with more contemporary leisure pursuits and venues. The few which remain retain their quintessential charm and appeal, but their heyday is long gone. Uncle David couldn't have foreseen this trend when he purchased his own model village in the early 1990s, although I doubt that it would have stopped him, as he never regarded the attraction of financial enterprise. I won't tell you the location of Uncle David's village. It doesn't exist anymore. But I can't guarantee that its former site is safe, or the evil that once dwelt there is now gone. However, I will describe it to you. The village was called Moseville, an odd name with slightly sinister overtones. This was the title the attraction came with when David bought it, and he was adamant that the name wouldn't change. He was a stickler for tradition, after all. Moseville was built to a scale of 1 to 72, and contained most of the features one would expect to find in a traditional English village, circa the late 19th or early 20th centuries. The main street consisted of a steepled church, Angelician, of course, a neat town hall with a copper-domed roof, and a schoolhouse with big glass windows. The street also contained several tidy shop fronts, a butcher's, a grocery, a village pub, and a bank as well as a post office, the type of small businesses which are slowly disappearing in the real world. Off the main street were the homes and houses, a mix of quaint cottages and Georgian townhouses. The detail was astonishing, right down to the tiny flower beds in the gardens surrounded by the white picket fences. The manor house was located on the edge of the village, close to the purposely built stream which cut through the mock countryside. The house was 4 stories tall with stained glass windows and turrets. The grounds around it were meticulously designed and maintained, with a neat, tree-lined avenue leading out to its front gates. Further along the river stood a functioning windmill, more in the Dutch rather than in the English design, but still in keeping with the ambience of the attraction. The final feature of note was the railway station to the south of the village, a long platform and red-bricked station house with an old steam locomotive that permanently sat on the rails, its adjoined carriages divided into first, second, and third classes. And then there were the figurines, the tiny villagers who populated Moseville. Each was unique and had their own names based on their roles and jobs: Lady of the Manor, the butcher, the vicar, the grocery's wife, the train conductor. All appeared to be happy people going about their daily business. Everything was well ordered and peaceful in Moseville, as it represented an oasis of tranquility in an otherwise chaotic world. Or at least, that's what we used to believe. As you can probably tell that I used to spend a lot of time in Moseville. My parents brought me and my sister down there regularly when we were young and before Mom and Dad got divorced, and I recall how magical a place it was to visit as a child. My uncle was always happy to see us and share his village with us, telling my sister and I the stories behind every building, feature, and figurine. He was strict, however, warning us to never mess around with his beloved village. I remember one time when we accidentally damaged the church roof whilst playing, and David was furious with us. His reaction was scary, and I guess we didn't understand why he was so obsessed with his village. Sadly, David was a man with a lot of problems. But life moved on. My sister and I grew up, and we stopped visiting Moseville and my uncle. I feel bad about it now, but I was a stroopy, hormonal teenager, and the last place that I wanted to hang out was a boring old model village. Sadly, Uncle David's mental state only deteriorated in the years that followed. He took early retirement from his job and became even more obsessed with building and maintaining Moseville. For a while, he ran it as a family attraction, charging a small entrance fee for families to visit on weekends and bank holidays. But eventually, he grew tired of these visitors and their disruptive ways, choosing to close Moseville to the public and make it its own private haven. In the years which followed, David became a total recluse, cutting ties with most of his family and the few friends that he had. My mother would still visit occasionally, mainly to check that her brother was still alive, but she usually received a frosty reception. I don't know what happened to David which made him cut himself off from the outside world and become completely engrossed in his almost childlike hobby. Perhaps he had suffered a personal tragedy or heartbreak which we didn't know about, or maybe he just couldn't cope with the stresses and pressures of the world. In any case, I'm afraid that his life was destined to end tragically. So let me tell you about the summer of 2001. My mother hadn't seen her brother in about 2 weeks. She phoned regularly enough, but my uncle rarely answered or called back. She went down to his cottage one day and couldn't get an answer when she rang the bell, or even when she knocked on the door repeatedly and loudly. Concerned, she used her spare key to enter David's home, but discovered that he wasn't at home. Alarm bells started ringing at this point, as David rarely, if ever, went out, but Mom didn't panic just yet. She did start to really worry when she drove to the Moseville site and found David's workshop empty and no signs of him in the village. Not only that, but the site was a mess, with miniature buildings smashed and the figurines broken and scattered all over the concrete and grass. Mom knew how much Moseville meant to her brother, and she could only imagine the impact that this act of wanton destruction would have on his mental state. At this point, she did panic and phoned the police, but they weren't able to file a missing persons report until after about 72 hours. The deadline came and went, and the report was processed, but no information was forthcoming. Mom phoned the police daily until they stopped returning her calls, and then she started her own search, getting stories published in the local press, posting missing signs all over the countryside, and starting a website requesting information, as this was before social media was a major thing. She worked so hard for a long time, but never got any solid leads. It was heartbreaking for us to see as this fruitless search consumed our mother. She always felt responsible for her brother's disappearance, feeling that she should have looked after him better. We told her constantly that she wasn't to blame, that he was a grown man who'd made his own decisions. But it was no good. Our mother kept the faith for years, still believing that David would turn up one day. I didn't share her belief, however. My uncle was always disturbed, and I feared that he had gone to some quiet spot to end his life. Perhaps his body had been swept up by the sea, and that's why he was never found. I think the whole family shared my theory, but we never spoke about it. And we never told my mom what we thought. It would have broken her heart. And in any case, the search went from cold to freezing, and after 7 long years, my uncle was declared legally dead. The sad milestone broke my mother. She went on with her life, being there for her family, children, and grandchildren. But a big part of her had died along with her brother, and she never really recovered from the tragedy. I think it surprised all of us when we discovered that David had written a will, and he had left all of his possessions and assets to my sister and I, including his beloved model village. My sister had just had a newborn and had no time to deal with this mess, and I couldn't ask our mother for help as it was still too raw for her. So I took on the task of dealing with my late uncle's estate. The plan was to sell up and split the money. There really wasn't any other practical option. David's cottage was in a bit of a state after all those years, but I knew some renovation would fix it up nicely, and with the housing market the way it was, we could sell it for a good price. Moseville was a different kettle of fish, however. There was little to no prospect of selling it as a going concern. The market for model villages in the modern world is almost non-existent for the reasons previously explained. And besides, the site was a mess. My best bet was to sell the land off for development, but first I needed to get the site appraised and valued, with due consideration given to planning permission and other issues. I made my initial visit to get a lay of the land. I admit to feeling a bit of trepidation on the drive down to the Moseville site, as all of the old memories came flooding back. We had good times there during our childhood, but I kept recalling how Uncle David had raged with us when we accidentally damaged the church roof, and the terrible sadness my mom carried with her after his disappearance. Unfortunately, my mood only darkened when I reached the site. The glory days of Moseville were clearly long gone, The once immaculately maintained streets, houses, and figurines were now in an awful mess. Everything was smashed up to hell or worn down by years of exposure to the elements. The village was fenced off, but the vandals had gotten in anyway, tagging the site with graffiti and adding to the destruction. I'll admit to having tears in my eyes as I surveyed the damage. It was tragic to see the once idyllic place reduced to such a terrible state. But there was something else too. I've never been much of a believer in the spiritual world, but something struck me as I walked through the ruined model village. I experienced a nearly crippling depression, a terrible sadness which went well beyond what I should be feeling. It was as if this once magical place had assumed a dark aura, one of tragedy and death which threatened to consume anyone who walked these grounds. I should have listened to my instincts, but of course I didn't. Instead, I told myself that my emotions had gotten the better of me and I needed to pull myself together. I had a job to do, however, unpleasant it may be, and so I got to work with clearing the site. And this is where my story takes a bizarre and dark twist. What I intend to do now is to transcribe the contents of my late uncle's diary, which I discovered during my clearance work. Most of its content is irrelevant, sadly giving little insight into the state of David's mind. That was until I got to the final few days before his disappearance. The diary entries answered some of my questions, but raised many more. And this will become self-evident as my story progresses. You may also be wondering how the diary went undiscovered all those long years while the police and my mother were on the case. Well, that's a question which is hard to answer. And so all I can say is, please listen on. So, let us begin with my Uncle David's entry for the 9th of July, 2001. Today the weather was quite good. It started off cloudy, but the sun came out in the afternoon. This marks a pleasant change of all the rain over the previous few days. Thank goodness, as I have much work to do. I spent the morning in my workshop, finishing off my villagers whilst touching up the paint on some of the existing people. The police constable's uniform needed retouched, and I'm excited about introducing the new undertaker to Moseville. As always, I need to work with painstaking accuracy on my little people to get them just right. Attention to detail is everything in this line of work. In the afternoon, I took advantage of the sunshine to do some of the work on the village, polishing the dome of the town hall and replacing 3 of the trees in the manor house grounds. Much to my annoyance, I saw that the stray tomcat had invaded my village once again. I didn't see the little bastard, but found evidence of his intrusion, with scratch marks on the church walls and several villages out of place, scattered down to the street with a blatant disrespect. This will have to stop. I phoned the council to complain, asking the animal control captures to stay, but I doubt that they will do anything about it. I may need to take action myself. My sister called this evening. I didn't answer, but she left a message on the machine. This only added to my annoyance. I know that she means well, but I wish that she would just leave me alone to get on with my work. Oh well. Tomorrow is another day. 10th of July, 2001. I am beyond furious. It has taken me all day to regain some level of composure so that way I can write down my experience and attempt to work through my anger. The day started like any other. I got up and I traveled to Moseville to start work. What I discovered was an atrocity. Someone, or probably multiple persons, had broke in during the night and proceeded to wreak devastation in an act of pure barbarism. The bulk of the damage was confined to the main street. Several of the villages were broken beyond repair. The grocer, the milkman, and the postmistress, all smashed to pieces. I don't know how anyone could be so cruel. There was some superficial damage to several buildings, but the vandals had taken out their anger on the church, breaking the steeple in half, crushing the roof and stomping the buildings into the ground. I will need to rebuild the whole church from scratch. I was so angry that tears were rolling down my cheeks and I had to control my breathing before considering my next move. Once I calmed down somewhat, I phoned the police to report this act of wanton destruction. Sadly, this only added to my anger. They said that they would process my report and send a constable out in due course, but I could tell that they weren't taking it seriously. No doubt the vandalism was carried out by local teenage hoodlums. Children today are little better than animals, semi-feral and without discipline from their parents or teachers. The police will do nothing to stop them, and so these hooligans run amok, destroying property and ruining people's lives. This country really has gone to the dogs. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning up the mess, but there was another sickening twist to this foul tale. I almost missed it at first, hidden away as it was at the rear of the wrecked church. And when I saw it, my whole heart froze for a second, and I believed that I was suffering a moment of genuine terror. The figure was built to the same scale as my village's, 1:72, meaning that it was only an inch tall. I knew straight away that it wasn't one of mine. After recovering from my initial shock, I got down on my hands and knees to examine the miniature in closer detail. And what I saw was a Grim Reaper, a sinister figure dressed in a dark robe down to his feet and with a hood covering his head. The figure had no face but did carry a scythe almost as tall as he was, its blade made from an actual tiny razor. I found the figurine repulsive and would have never had such an ugly miniature in my village. But this raised the disturbing question of who had left the figure and why. I began to doubt my initial theory in that moment, thinking that it was too sophisticated of a trick for teenage hoodlums. Perhaps this is the act of a rival model villager, jealous of my creation. I took the Grim Reaper figure back to my workshop to examine it more closely. I examined it under my magnifying glass, impressed by the precision its maker had used. This was clearly the work of a professional. There was something very disconcerting about the miniature, though, a creepy feeling that I couldn't quite explain. But things only got weirder. When I picked up the figure, I found that it was ice cold, like it was just out of the freezer. But as I held it in my hand, the figurine suddenly and inexplicably heated up, and in a moment it became so hot that it burned my hand, forcing me to drop it to the floor. Now, I will admit to swearing in rage as I looked down at the tiny Grim Reaper figure lying on the wood floor of my workshop. I couldn't understand what had just happened. Was this some sort of new technology? I'll gladly admit to being a Luddite, so I suppose that it's possible. I should have kept the figure as evidence, but in my anger I acted in haste, using pliers to pick up the red-hot miniature and drop it into the furnace, watching with a grim satisfaction as it burnt to ashes. It's bedtime now, but I'm still angry and confused, so I doubt that I'll get much sleep tonight. In any case, I will return to Moseville first thing in the morning. I pray that this ugly incident is a one-off, and I can put it behind me. 11th of July, 2001. The intruders returned during the night. It was naive for me to think that they wouldn't. I'm angry, but also deeply unsettled. Let me try to explain what happened. I arrived at Moseville shortly after dawn, and I went to work on the church reconstruction. At first, it didn't seem like there were any additional damage, but then I noticed several of the villagers were missing. The pub landlord, the schoolmistress, the fisherman, the nurse, and the mayor were all gone. I searched frantically for my little people, hoping against hope that I'd simply misplaced them. I couldn't find their bodies, but I did find their heads. Yes, I can hardly believe that I'm writing this, but that's what I had found. 5 tiny, severed heads, all carefully impaled on the railings in front of the town hall, forming a sick and macabre display. I could hardly believe my eyes. I was horrified, disgusted, and also amazed. The amount of effort that it must have taken to remove the heads from the 1-inch models and mount them to the railings that are only millimeters thick. It almost defied belief. And I struggled to breathe as I surveyed the scene, but then I saw it. The Grim Reaper miniature. That hateful figure. It was just standing there in the middle of the main street. It was as if it were mocking me. It couldn't possibly be the same model from the previous day. I'd watched it burn, for God's sake. And I stared at the Reaper for a moment before realizing that whoever was doing that must have made several copies of the figure to mess with my head. I felt paranoid in the moment, scanning the horizon as I imagined my tormentor was watching from afar. And I soon reassured myself, however. I felt sure that the vandal was too much of a coward to show his face during the daylight. He would surely return under the cover of darkness, but next time I would be waiting for him. And in a fit of rage, I stomped the Grim Reaper under my boot, crushing it into the little tiny pieces. Enough is enough. Tonight I will stand guard right here and catch the bastard in the act. He is going to regret ever messing with me. 12th of July, 2001. I am in hell. Is this real? I don't understand, and I am so scared. I fell asleep at some point during the night, lying on the grass beside my precious village. It wasn't my intention to do so, but I was so tired. And when I awoke, I instantly realized that something wasn't right. It seemed like a nightmare, but somehow it's real. The grass that I had slept upon was now as tall as I was. I stared at the blades in astonishment and then at the mud beneath my feet. In confusion, I staggered backwards, pulling up my way through the tall grass and hoping in vain that there was some kind of logical explanation. I saw a sunflower twice my size and almost had a heart attack, but this was only the start of it. As I trudged through the mud, I saw the dirt in front of me move as something huge emerged from beneath the ground. I stepped back, recoiling in horror as I watched a massive, slimy snake-like beast burrow its way up to the surface and slither out from the hole that it had created. It took me a moment to realize what I was seeing, as its pink, segmented form wriggled out and into the open. It was an earthworm, but grown to an immense size, an impossible size, easily as long as I was high and with a body as thick as my thigh. But I stood there, paralyzed in fear, as I watched the beast blindly slithering toward me. But a moment later, a huge shadow appeared above my head, a massive form which dwarfed both me and the worm. There was this almighty squawk, a high-pitched din that almost deafened me. And a second later, and that huge winged beast dived down, reached out with its mighty talons. I watched in terror as the creature rapidly impaled the earthworm with its sharp talons before it secured it with a mighty beak. The winged beast squawked again as it flapped its vast wings and ascended back into the blue skies. I looked up as my unlikely savior flew away and was once again astonished to recognize the black, brown, and white feathers of the monster bird, which I realized was nothing more than a common garden sparrow. And I broke in that moment, still not understanding, but knowing that I was in grave danger. I sprinted for so long, cutting my way through the tall blades of grass and the giant wildflowers, and eventually I reached the edge of the grassland and I found myself walking on hard concrete. I stopped and I looked ahead, and then I saw it. Moseville, my miniature village. Except it wasn't miniature anymore. The scale was 1-to-1. The town hall towered above me, and the wrecked church stood in front of me, and the villagers were equal to my own height. My tired brain struggled to comprehend the terrifying implications, and the answer was so obvious as it was impossible. Moseville hadn't magically grown to full size overnight, but instead, I had shrunk. Inexplicably, I was now a mere inch tall, potentially prey to insects and small birds, and with nothing but the clothes on my back and the diary that I carried with me, which has also been shrunken to a proportionally small size. And what's more, I was trapped in my own creation, a resident of my miniature village and entirely cut off from the real world. I tried to control my panic as I slowly walked along the main street that I had so carefully built and maintained over all of these years. I was certainly frightened by this inexplicable development, but also exhilarated at seeing my beloved Moseville in a way that I had never thought possible in my wildest dreams. But my boy's fascination didn't last, as soon I had a new threat to deal with. I heard a familiar sound, a foul hissing amplified 100-fold. And when I looked up, I saw the beast, a leviathan to me in my reduced form. It was the black tomcat, the stray which had caused me trouble over the last few weeks. I had been able to see the feline off easily enough when I was a 6-foot-tall man, but now this small cat was as big as a T-Rex in comparison to my puny size. It stood at the far end of the village, its hungry green eyes glaring at me like I was nothing more than a kitty treat. And I gasped in horror as I saw the cat stand up tall, its ears pinned back and eyes widening before it charged. The monster stomped along the concrete main street, the ground shaking under its huge size and weight. And I ran for my life, desperately seeking sanctuary as the predator rapidly closed the gap. I made it to the tower hall just in the nick of time, sprinting in through the doorway and diving into cover. And the cat reached the door a second later, but thankfully it was far too big to get inside. It glared into the entryway with its predatory eyes, opening its maw to reveal huge and sharp fangs. and when it shoved its paw through the tiny doorway, reaching out with its deadly claws. I had screamed, retreating back to the far wall and as far away as possible from the clawing attack. Fortunately, I was just out of reach of the predator and so remained relatively safe inside the structure. The cat had continued its attempt to break in, but thankfully without success. I had hoped that it would give up and seek alternative prey, but instead the beast lay down on the main street, glaring at the town hall as it patiently waited for me to come out. It's as if the cat had a personal vendetta against me and wouldn't give up until I was inside of its belly. I had remained trapped inside the town hall as I write this, without food, water, or any prospect of rescue. I'm alone and scared, and I don't know how I'll get out of this in one piece. 12th of July, 2001. Evening. The cat had left shortly after dusk. Actually, it didn't so much as leave as it had fled. I heard a high-pitched meow before the beast sped off at top speed, shaking the ground beneath its paws. I was relieved but also concerned. What in the hell had scared the feline away? Was it another cat or a dog? I feared that I might be in even greater danger than before. But then again, perhaps the cat had been frightened off by a human being. Had my sister come looking for me? If so, maybe she could save me from this hellish predicament. I cowered in the town hall for several more hours before I felt brave enough to poke my head outside of the door. And to my relief, I saw that it was all clear. The cat was nowhere in sight, but nor was anyone else. Feeling a bit bolder, I opted to explore the village under the dim light of the moon and the stars. This was not a wise decision. As I cautiously walked up and down the main street past the model shops and lamp posts, I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. My throat was dry, and I had nothing to drink in the past part for 24 hours, and so I proceeded to the stream, cupping water in my hands and slipping it up greedily. And for a moment I felt better, but then I raised my head and I saw it. The Grim Reaper figurine, standing just beyond the gates to the manor house, glaring down upon me from the hillside. This was its third appearance, except now it was no longer a tiny model I could crush beneath my foot. The Reaper was now as tall as I was, and I felt sure that this thing, whatever it was, surely it was responsible for my grim predicament, using some fork of dark magic to reduce me to this tiny stature. I can't explain why, but in that moment a cold terror pulsated through me as I believed that I was in mortal danger. Turning on my heels, I fled for my life, sprinting back to the town hall and sealing myself inside. I'm still here, cold, afraid, and hungry. I don't dare to leave my sanctuary again before dawn. I can only hope and pray that my prospects improve. 12/7, 2001. I don't know what time. My God. Hell has come to my door. My own creations have turned against me. I write frantically as I don't have much time. I slept for a short spell, waking in some time in the early hours. When I went to the window, my heart froze as I witnessed my worst nightmares come to life. All of my villagers were standing out there on the main street. The artisans, the school children, and all of the professors, even the 5 previously taken minus their heads. They all stood there with menacing intent, forming a mob and facing the town hall. Those who still had their heads looked different than before. Their smiles, once on their faces, now turned into mouths emitting silent screams, and their once friendly eyes now narrowed in anger. At their head was my nemesis, the dreaded Grim Reaper, his scythe in hand as he pointed the sinister weapon in my direction. And then it started. The Reaper gave the order, lowering his scythe and pointing it in my direction. This was the signal. Into my shock and horror, the villagers all suddenly came to life, slowly marching forward in an awkward, almost mechanical fashion. I had no doubt that they meant to do me harm, and I cower inside as I scribble this note, which will surely be my final word. They are banging on the doors and the windows, trying to break in. There is no escape. I hope against hope that someone will find this journal and get word to my family, to my sister, to my nephew, and to my niece. I am so sorry that I pushed you away. I love you all. This was my uncle's last entry, and I don't mind telling you his final words moved me to tears. You're probably wondering how I discovered my late uncle's diary. Well, in many ways it was by pure chance whilst I was clearing out the site. The journal was still in its reduced size, a micro-miniature book less than 1/4 of an inch in dimension. I could have ended up throwing it out along with the other tiny models. But as I held it in my palm in my hand, I had a feeling which made me think of my uncle. I had to acquire special equipment to view the tiny book and use a powerful microscope to read my uncle's words. His terrible end defied belief. Yet I know in my heart it was the truth. I never told my mother about my discovery, fearing what it would do to her. She went to her grave without her knowing the truth. There was no body to bury, and I could only assume his tiny corpse was taken away by his killers or consumed by local wildlife. I don't like to dwell on it, however, as it sickens me to imagine my uncle's final moments. And as for Mosville, I had it completely demolished and sold the land. And I've never returned to the location in all the years since. I can't help but feel that this bizarre tragedy would not have happened if David had kept in touch with his family. And in the end, you could say that his obsession killed him. I don't know what you'll make of this story. I still don't fully understand it myself. All I know is that there are dark powers beyond our comprehension, and my Uncle David sadly fell afoul of them. And so my final advice is to take care, because you can never know where an unhealthy obsession will lead you. Was supposed to go on a date. Emily. We had been texting for a couple of weeks. Flirty, fun, stupid little inside jokes that made me feel good in a way that I hadn't in a long time. She even called me cute. Said that she liked quiet guys. We had made plans for Friday night. I had shaved, actually ironed a shirt, even cleaned the inside of my car, just in case we drove somewhere after. But when I texted her that afternoon to confirm, nothing came back. No response. And hours had passed. And still nothing. I tried not to spiral. Maybe something came up. Maybe she lost her phone. Maybe I was just ghosted again. It happens. Still, I kept checking. Over and over like an idiot. With the evening suddenly free and nowhere to be, I figured that I'd finally crawl into the attic and check the water damage above the kitchen. It had been on my to-do list for weeks, and I needed something to do. Something to feel useful. The attic was cramped, filled with old boxes and that pink cotton insulation that always makes your skin itch. I aimed my flashlight at the far end, near the exterior wall. And that's when I noticed it. A section of the drywall that didn't belong. It was subtle, cheaper than the rest, and slightly cleaner. No seams, no screws. Just a slab of board sealed with cracked, yellowed caulk. I don't know why, but I started cutting it open. Something in me went still. Not curious, not anxious, just quiet. Autopilot. The blade of my box cutter slipped in easy, like the wall wanted to open. A few slices, some pressure, and the board shifted inward with a soft crack, and cold air pushed away. And behind it was a hidden room. No windows, no furniture, just a low ceiling, raw beams, and a bare bulb dangling from a wire. It trembled in the draft that I had let in. The smell hit me first. Rot, piss, and copper. The kind of stink that clings to wood, seeps into the grain. It never leaves. A smell that knows. The floor was warped and stained, dark patches across the boards, deep gouges in the planks, like someone had clawed them raw. Blood, long dried, had soaked into the slats and left them black and swollen. In the middle of the room sat a mattress, foam, yellowed, soaked through. No sheets, no blanket, just filth and restraints. Bolted into the floor joists, positioned low, fixed wide apart, exactly where a person's limbs would go if they were bent over on all fours, like some sick kennel setup, exposed, vulnerable. At first, I figured that it was some redneck sex dungeon left behind by the previous owner. Maybe a place to film kink videos or do meth or whatever kind of shit gets tucked away and forgotten in these old houses. I even laughed. That weird off-key kind of laugh that means that you're unsettled but pretending not to be. But I couldn't sleep that night. Not a second. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the scratches, the warped floor, the way that the bulb had swayed as if something had been there. And so the next morning, I went back up. Told myself that it was curiosity, maybe even closure. Like if I looked one more time, I'd be able to laugh at it for real and move on. And I crouched beside the mattress, ran a finger along the edge, and something sharp caught my skin. I lifted the corner, peeled it back, and found it. A silver chain, thin, smudged with blood. The pendant on the end was small, oval, almost elegant. I turned it over in my palm. And there it was, in delicate, curling cursive. Emily. My brain blanked, my heart stopped, and then it came back. One memory at a time, like knives being pulled out slow, dull and serrated. I had drilled the restraints myself, took measurements, even knelt on the floor and mapped it out with masking tape to make sure that her arms and legs would stretch just right. Bent and obedient. No room to shift. No chance to run. I told her it was a date, lit a candle, and smiled when she looked confused. Set a paper plate down with half a sandwich and a dog bowl full of water. And she screamed when I called her baby. Cried when I told her that she was special. No one else ever made me feel seen. I remembered the belt, folded it slow, ran it between my hands like a priest threading rosary beads. And when I struck her, it wasn't rage. It was careful, measured. I let the leather kiss the inside of her thighs first, the soft skin, watched her flinch, watched the pink rise. She clenched her fists, bit her lip. Wouldn't make a sound. I started whispering between each blow, told her how much I loved her, how close I felt when she cried. I made her hold eye contact. I made her say thank you. The belt welts layered like heat maps, red, then purple, and then open. I licked one once, just to see her shudder. And when she sagged forward, I pulled her back up by the hair and reminded her that love isn't supposed to feel safe. It's supposed to burn. When she stopped calling me sweetheart, I held her hand like I was about to propose. I kissed her palm and told her that she had pianist fingers. And then I broke them. One by one. Thumb first. A hard, fast bend. Snap. Index. Slower. I watched the tendons stretch like taffy before they popped. Middle. That one fought. I had to brace her hand against the floor and lean in until the bone gave with a wet little crunch. And she screamed until her throat gave out. I didn't stop. I kissed the bruises as they swelled. And when she pissed herself, I didn't speak. I just grabbed her by the ankle and dragged her to the corner, cleaned her with a rag and cold water. But not out of kindness. I just couldn't stand her smelling like anything but me. She wasn't allowed to speak until she would say that she loved me. And I made her say it again and again until her voice cracked and the words sounded like vomit. I told her that it was the most beautiful thing that I had ever heard. And one night she stopped reacting. Didn't flinch when I unbuckled my belt. Didn't cry when I touched her. Didn't beg. She stared at me, like I wasn't there anymore. So I picked up the hammer. The first blow cracked her teeth. The second shattered her jaw. And the third buried itself in her temple and stuck. I had to pry it out like a nail. And she twitched, made a sound. Wet. Bubbling. Her eyes rolled back but never closed. I watched her die for 7 minutes. Didn't move. Didn't speak. Just watched. I wrapped her in a tarp, pulled her to the old ductwork behind the wall. I remember how soft she felt, how warm, her blood soaking into my shirt. And I didn't change it for 3 days. And then I sealed it, screwed the board in, caulked the edges, buried her in insulation, layer by layer. And I cleaned the mattress, replaced the bucket, and swept the floor. And forgot. And I forgot. I made myself forget. I went to work, ate dinner, slept in the room just beneath her corpse like nothing had ever happened. I even dated again. Told people that I'd been ghosted once and it had really messed with me. But the house remembered. The stink, the rot in the beams, the cold spot that never left. The walls knew. And now, so do I.